Good morning, everybody. My name is Sheila Redzepi. A very warm welcome from me here. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. We are delighted to host Achim Steiner, the United Nations Development Program Administrator, and his wonderful team for a timely discussion of the new Human Development Report, The Next Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene. Very appropriate theme. As you can imagine, partnership is at the very heart of our efforts to help people thrive and to collectively address the many global challenges we are faced with. And as the current pandemic has taught us in recent times, global crises, of course, require global cooperation and global response. The World Bank Group and the UNDP have enjoyed decades of excellent cooperation, I should say, from implementing and financing national development agendas to joint action to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Of course, all the work on strengthening the humanitarian development nexus, and the work that we do together in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And of course, collecting and using data to ensure those very targeted outcomes. Now, more broadly, I should say our cooperation with the United Nations agencies, including UNDP, at the country level is even more important to ensure that we have a coordinated and effective response to the pandemic and to big challenges such as climate change. Now, of course, I should say, importantly, we also learn from one another. We share best practices, we exchange knowledge as much as we can, leveraging each institution's comparative advantage. So this morning, we're absolutely delighted to have Achim Steiner and his team join us in that very spirit of knowledge exchange to share the findings of the 2020 Human Development Report and what our respective institutions are doing to advance the much needed transformative change in the countries. Joining Achim on the bank side for the opening conversation is Mari Pangestu, our Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnerships. So a welcome to Mari as well. Now, there is so much to talk about, so I am going to thank Farhad Peykar from our New York office, who is kindly acting as today's moderator to get this conversation started. I want to thank you all again for joining, and a big thanks to Achim and his team for sharing this important work with us. Farhad, over to you.
Thank you, Sheila. Welcome to all World Bank Group and UNDP colleagues joining us today. My name is Farhad Peykar, and I work with the World Bank Group's office in New York. It's my utmost honor to moderate today's session. In the next 1 hour, we will have the following sections for you: a conversation with UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner and World Bank Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnerships, Mari Pangestu, on the 2020 Human Development Report. Next, we will hear from UNDP and World Bank experts on the technical aspects of the report. We will then open up the session for Q&A with you all. Last, Ulrika Mudir, Assistant Administrator and Director for External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP, will wrap up the event with closing remarks. So first up, the new frontier, human development and the Anthropocene, the age of man. Achim, really good to see you today and welcome. To get things started, could you please walk us through some of the highlights of the 2020 Human Development Report? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Farhad. Thank you, Sheila. And Mari, thank you very much for creating the space for us to come together in what, Sheila, you described as a multi-tiered relationship, partnership that is decades old. And yet from time to time, we also connect in a way that I think is significant to many beyond our institutions. It is the part that I think in both our institutions we refer to as thought leadership, trying to perhaps reset some thinking in the way that we approach development. And, I accompanied the bank as a very active partner when you were evolving the Human Capital Index as a, articulation of and an evolution of that understanding of how one actually measures and helps countries, governments, societies to also prioritize development decisions, development investments. So here is the Human Development Report. You are all familiar with its probably 30-year history. It is quite a proud history in which UNDP, I think over 3 decades, not every year, but from time to time, I think strikes a nerve in usually what is a sense of discomfort about continuing to move along a line that we know ultimately will not be sufficient to take us where we believe the future of development needs to take us. And the 2020 report, I think, is in part something that all of you in the bank and we in UNDP will on the surface recognize. And on the other hand, as you will see with, I think, 2 elements that we introduced, also find hopefully intriguing. One is, as you already mentioned, Sheila, the notion of the Anthropocene. It is trying to give expression to, what often is data. We talk about climate change, loss of ecosystems, loss of arable land, water stress. We transact, so to speak, a planetary change in statistical terms, but there is a civilizational element that is, I think that's how I would describe it, that suddenly has begun to emerge, namely that we are transforming the fundamental life support systems on the planet, and they're beginning to enter that red zone of actually compromising literally the functionality, be it ecosystems, the atmosphere, pollution. I mean, we all know the topics. And I have found for a number of years this discourse around the Anthropocene very interesting because it emerges out of the geoscience view, and at the same time was shaped by Paul Knudsen, the one of the scientists who really brought our attention to the ozone, the hole in the ozone layer at the time. And he felt that we needed to move into a way of thinking about our presence on the planet that was no longer defined by the Holocene, but by realizing that we are at a point in time where humans literally are fundamentally affecting the planet. And there are some who will find this concept abstract, some will find it, dystopian. I don't see it that way at all. It is a moment of realization how serious and how systemic our impact has become, but it actually is, on the other hand, also the realization that we have choices and that humans have never in history before had as many possibilities to choose different courses as before. So the Anthropocene is a very liberating concept. The second part of the report that I think is trying to break through a consistent failure that we have all brought to this. We all talk about sustainable development. We still operate in the silos. We analyze the world in sectors. UNDP this year introduced this experimental planetary adjusted human development index, trying to find a way in which we can speak about human development back to Amartya Sen and Mahbub Haq in the origins of that notion of human development, but in a contemporary sense where we know that what humans do will fundamentally compromise or enable human development in the future. We have not found a smart way to give expression to that in an index or an indicator. Now, the critiques of indicators are still present and valid, and we hope, particularly with you as colleagues in the bank, to interrogate whether this is a direction that is worth pursuing, because that is what we set out to do. And we called it an experimental index because we want to signal that we haven't completed the work, just like you worked on the Human Capital Index also in iterative steps. We want to reach out particularly to our colleagues in the bank because you work in the same space, you have enormous capacity, we work with the same realities and the same partners, and it is around that discussion that I hope this year's report actually will give rise to some very creative co-creation, co-thinking, and in that sense, perhaps alignment in the way we speak about development to the world at large in the years to come. So I'll stop here, but that is a little bit, let's say, the front, the Anthropocene and the methodological dimension of this year's report.
Thank you, Achim. You provided some sobering facts and also very uplifting messages. Mari, if I may turn to you now, what were some of your reflections as you read the report? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Farhad. And first of all, I'd like to welcome Achim and his team. And thank you for finding time to join us and having this idea to have a virtual all-staff seminar to launch the 2020 Human Development Report. Let me also congratulate you and your team on this report and marking the 30th anniversary of the report with such an you'll call it experimental, but I would say impressive study. Let me just reflect on the last 30 years, if I may, that, UNDP has been in this space of the Human Development Report, which was pioneering 30 years ago, putting people at the center of development. And I think having these metrics, as you said, are very important for policymakers. I myself, having spent 10 years as a policymaker, I know that the Human Development Index report has always been something that we look out for every year. And for us, it wasn't just at the national level, but also at the sub-national levels. So, you look at the poverty levels, and then you look at the Human Development Index measures. And it's an opening for a dialogue and understanding the drivers for human development outcomes. And therefore, as you also have emphasized, policy implications and budget prioritization. And, the reforms that are needed both at the national and sub-national levels. And I also know that investors also look at the Human Development Index because it's a measure of the quality of human resources that drive their investment decisions. So on all fronts, it has been, I think, a really great document and measures of human development. And now with the 2020 report, with focusing on Anthropocene, I had to look up how to pronounce that, by the way. It's incredibly timely and once again pushes the frontiers by recognizing how human progress is not possible without addressing climate change and how human activity is affecting the environment now and having importantly future effects. I think you put it rightly, Achim, that we do need to address some of the discomfort, the uncomfortable issues that we grapple with, and trying to put a measure on it. You will face a lot of criticism and questions and inputs, but I think it was important. I would just appreciate that you've started this process. And I was reminded of the voice of Mother Nature, a la Julia Roberts. Nature doesn't need people, but people need nature. Your actions determine your fate. So I thought that was a very, just to link it back to something that has been said in the past. And it is indeed ironical that, the ability of humans to have such major influence over environment at a planetary scale is there, but we struggle to find the wherewithal to meet the basic needs of a large portion of the planet's population. And I actually think you've done a great thing by using this approach, because if you say, okay, humans are, you said that really it's the humans that are affecting the planet, but the inequality is there. We know that it's different groups of humans that are causing a lot of the climate the destruction of the planet. But it is the poorest and the most vulnerable which bear the brunt, and our most recent poverty report speaks to that, how it's COVID, climate, and conflict, which are the drivers of poverty. So it's very much in line with this notion of the inequality outcomes that we see. And so your added measures on CO2 emission and material footprint, I think, is going to be very pioneering as to how we can imagine or reimagine a path of development that will recognize this interconnectedness. And I really think, most importantly, as a former policymaker, it will really help the narrative for policymakers of addressing climate action and how important it is for human development. You can then start talking about the more healthier, more productive human resources, better well-being, and so on. And these are words that policymakers and politicians will need to stress the importance of taking climate action. Thank you. I'll end there, Farhad.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Mari. Achim, if I may come back to you, what are some of the policy recommendations that the report provides to navigate this new age? Over to you.
Well, if I may just pick up, because it links into the policy recommendations on one aspect that Mari spoke to just now, and this notion of inequality. the 2019 Human Development Report took that issue of inequality right into the center, and with Pedro Conceição, who leads the Human Development Report office and team, and he and his team really deserve credit for having not listened to the rest of us in UNDP and done what they thought was the right thing to do. This report, the one last year and the one next year, are really part of a trilogy in which we explore inequality. Now, that may sound surprising, but if you look at the 2020 report, The Next Frontier, it actually is deeply rooted also, first of all, in the impact that inequalities have on what we're doing, but secondly, on what we are doing, how it will actually worsen inequalities, including the intergenerational dimension of inequality. So I absolutely want to emphasize and underline what Mari said. Inequality is part of the fabric of our 21st century society that we have to tackle. And if I reduce in my own mind what is at the core of, you can call it a social contract, the future of development, many ways and frame this. It really comes down to how we tackle these two phenomena of inequality and sustainability or lack thereof. I think these are the variables of a successful human development paradigm in the 21st century. Now, in terms of policy recommendations, Pedro obviously will also be able to add to that later in the discussion with staff, but the Human Development Report has always been cautious not to combine too much policy recommendation into it. So it's something that we debate sometimes also with our colleagues in the HDR office. But to me, it's been a challenge now that UNDP must take that report and think about how do we work with this when we then next sit down with the Prime Minister, with the Minister of Planning, or the development constituencies of a country. The three broad areas that the 2020 HDR pointed out in which the policy actionability emerges are around this notion of social norms. Now, to some that may sound abstract, but to you as colleagues in the bank, you know exactly that there are 15 tiers to this notion of social norms, but it was trying to essentially bring us back to a fundamental. If you cannot change the norms with which we look at development, and therefore are willing to trade off my well-being with my neighbor's well-being, people upstream from downstream. And, I could go on. The examples of trading off, of choosing my interests over the interests of others. And remember, we are living through an intense moment of that with vaccine nationalism right now. That social norm is at the core of the policy agenda that you need to derive if you really want to, begin to act on what we are seeing and recognizing. The second part clearly is in the domain of innovation. We are not powerless, and whether it is technology, whether it is social policy, and look at how the laws of financial gravity have been suspended over the last 12 months with the $1 trillion packages. We humans rationalize sometimes impossibilities in an extraordinarily determined way until we hit a moment where we realize actually that simply isn't the right way to respond. And I think innovation is as much about digital technology, frontiers, renewables, etc., new urban infrastructure, as it is about the way in which we can create inclusive economies, in the way we can invest in the Achilles heels that are there. And I, again, link back to the Human Capital Index. And so that's the second domain in which a whole series of policy domains emerge in which different choices actually need to be made explicit, because people are often sold, including by institutions such as ours, let's be honest, with singular menus, when really there are deep choices that we can make. And I think we need to become more capable of locating the policy choices, not only in an abstract macroeconomic theory or policy of development, theory of change, but rather in the context, which is one reason why in UNDP we invested over the last 2 years in setting up these accelerator labs in 90 country teams around the world. It's something that I hope in due course we will find many reasons to connect also with colleagues in the bank, because we wanted to shift our focus to actually studying where development dynamic emerges from within a country. And the third area is clearly the focus on understanding the inextricable relationship we have with nature. To some, this is the thing that I do when I go to Central Park on Sunday if I'm in New York, or I go to Kenya for a safari, or I enjoy swimming in a clean ocean. This is so much more profound. It is actually recognizing that The 20th century tried to teach us almost an understanding where development was essentially humans becoming independent of nature. Very understandable. I mean, if you lived, as a farmer and every second, third year you had a drought, I mean, depending on nature was a nightmare. But it has gone to the point where we think that we can divorce ourselves from nature as humanity and as a economic construct. And I think what we are realizing, that's the Anthropocene notion here, that actually nature is fundamental to the future of human development in the 21st century, and not in a kind of simplistic, let's protect nature, but we have to reinvent our economies in terms of being able to, develop with nature and to be able to invest in nature. And that goes to some of the fundamental failures of our economic tools. Externalizing nature. Now, I don't need to tell anybody in the World Bank, we are beyond that point, but look at the core indicators of our development investments, of our national strategies, of measuring development success. And you very quickly end up back in a very similar space where we were 20, 30 years ago, a very narrow view of what matters in the short term and largely at the expense of the longer term. And this is where I think the bank, UNDP, development institutions carry a legacy responsibility as much as an opportunity responsibility to step forward here. We need to offer countries smarter ways in which to invest. And nature is integral to that in the larger sense of the word. So I'll stop here, Farhad, but these are three domains in which we see enormous policy opportunity within the many things that we recognize, but often they are still exotic, they are peripheral, they are theoretical. We have run out of time. Time is running out. And that has been a central reason for perhaps bringing that Anthropocene notion into the discussion.
Thank you, Achim. I want to start with the point that you said, there's smarter ways. Mari, we had the One Planet Summit earlier this month, in which the biodiversity was recognized as an important element to human and environmental health. I know you talked a little bit about it, but could you elaborate a little bit that how does the World Bank marry climate smart development with human development in its projects and its efforts to support client countries? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Farhad. I think we have come a long way in the way we are thinking about how to have climate smart development. And at the One Planet Summit, as well as in December, I think our president has been really emphasizing the message of the importance of us as the World Bank Group really focusing on a development which has a climate smart policies as well as approach. So I think our premise is really how climate smart, or what we often call as low carbon development, is not a trade-off for achieving growth and development outcomes, such as jobs and human development. So a lot of our work with countries and policymakers, our knowledge and analytical work, and we are also developing a set of tools to help countries look at how low carbon development needs to be integrated into their national planning. Achim mentioned that we need to really account for nature in development, and this is exactly what this is all about. So we are also looking at nature-based accounting. I believe Rwanda is one country which has actually already adopted nature-based accounting. So we are working with countries. You work with countries that have champions and that have the political will to do it, in the hope that, as you were saying, policy recommendations. We can make the policy recommendations, but countries are the ones that do it at the end. But if you have a series of countries that do it, then it can have demonstration effect for other countries, right? So, and we're also working with countries on budget planning, as well as the reforms that will be needed to change systems, whether it's energy, transport, food and land use, industry, and waste management, all these that contribute to the CO2 emission. And I worked hard on this actually before I joined the bank, when I was in government, as well as when I left government, because I saw the tremendous importance for policymakers, who are also political leaders, While we may be aware at the individual level that environment impacts human development and vice versa, and that policy choices made today are felt by future generations. You can take investing in coal power plants as a really concrete example. The reality is we have very short political cycles. Politicians and policymakers have this short political cycle. So this has always been a battle. And so ensuring that we can provide a narrative and empirical evidence that low carbon development is good for lowering carbon emissions and improving growth and human development, healthier populations, higher productivity, well-being, and living standards is very important for the politician and the policymaker. And I would say for the wider discussion in the society, because at the end of the day, the society are the ones that will vote the politicians in, right? So the moment environment issues, climate action issues, just like what happened in Europe, become a key political agenda, the politicians will also move, right? So I do think we need to go beyond, when you say talk about policy recommendations, it's not just to policymakers, but I also think it needs to go wider. And of course, the World Bank has been doing climate financing. I think we are the largest bank, a multilateral development bank that is having the climate financing to the tune of 83 billion. And we are looking at climate co-benefits that is financing not just mitigation, but adaptation strategies in health, education, and social protection projects. But in our new climate action plan, which was the target has been announced by the president at 35%, so going from 30 to 35% of our climate financing, which will have climate co-benefits. We are very conscious that it's not just about the climate co-benefits. It's more about how the impact, the development impact, including on human development. So this is going to be kind of the basic principle. We hope that will be more all-encompassing rather than just as an afterthought. If you like, in the past, it was probably an afterthought in the country programs. But since the last 6 months, especially, there's been a lot of attention on what many of us are saying. Climate action has to be in the DNA of all country programs. This is just to emphasize the language the top leadership is using and emphasizing to the country level. I'll just close with one specific example, which was announced at the One Planet Summit earlier this month, and this there will be many examples like this. The World Bank plans to invest over $5 billion over the next 5 years to help restore degraded landscapes, improve agriculture productivity, and promote livelihoods across 11 countries of the Sahel, Lake Chad, and Horn of Africa. So you can see that this is about restoring degraded landscapes, but at the end of the day, it will improve agriculture productivity and the farmers' livelihoods, and therefore human development, poverty, and so on. And in just a final similar example is that in a lot of the stimulus programs that we are working with countries, a lot of them also focus on creation of jobs in the stimulus programs, of restoration, seascapes and landscapes, which will create jobs during the stimulus, but at the end improve the land or the sea for the farmers and the fishermen, or for tourism for that matter. That will then improve livelihoods and human development. So this is the kind of what I would call smart climate and development actions.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Mari. I know we are running out of the time, but at the end, I just wanted to give you both maybe around 1 minute each to share with us your final thoughts. World Bank Group, UNDP colleagues are listening to you now, and if you have any advice. So if I may start with you, Achim, first, just give us 1 minute final words. Thank you.
It's difficult. I just recorded a TED Talk, which was trying to sort of link this complexity of what we often deal with in our everyday lives when we do country analysis and develop country strategies and investment plans to this notion of powerlessness. One of the things I think we're all learning is that governments are central to societies being functional, but they are not exclusively the drivers of wise decision making. And I think we live in a time that often is very disempowering for people. The science of climate change, the digital universe, artificial intelligence, blockchain. I mean, there's a whole world out there that most of us, at best know how to spell it, and then we come with Anthropocene on top of it. So I go back to Mari's and Sheila's point earlier on. But I think if there's one thing that to me remains critical is we need systems change. We all talk about, systems approaches. If that narrative ends up making people feel even more disempowered, then we have made a big mistake. So in that TED Talk, I make the point that it's not systems that change systems, it's people that change systems. And we have to find different ways of engaging. The Human Development Report is obviously not your sort of bedside reading, as Mari probably found out when she was asked, can you have a look at this report? And I blame Pedro entirely, who can explain why it took 200 and something pages to get there. But the point is, you don't always have to be in the kitchen in order to be able to understand what it is that you can actually do about what happens next. And I think our discussions, our discourse with the public at large, civil society, private sector actors, needs to be more empowering. And I think if that is a place where we in UNDP, the UN Development System, the World Bank Group, can more deliberately meet, I think we will make an enormous change to people's sense of being able to do something about it. And Indonesia, Mari, just to pick up on your own life journey of studying development, I mean, it has had all the phases of autocratic politics, democratic politics, frontier thinking about addressing climate change, but still having the geography of the country, the poverty, the local government dimensions. I think we can provide people with far greater space to help shape solutions, smart solutions, if we as development agencies also recalibrate the way we engage. And hopefully that's part of the discussion that will carry us forward as we take the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, into the real lives of where people make choices and decisions, including, as Mari said, politicians. I mean, we always blame politicians, but if they only have a 4-year cycle or a 5-year cycle in which they have to be elected, they act rationally. So can we do something to enable them to also act more smartly and not just rationally in terms of their re-election? That's also part of good development advice and cooperation. Thanks, Farhad.
Thank you, Achim. Mari, over to you.
Thank you. I would just like to agree with Achim that it's about systems change. And to get to systems change, you do need the narrative. And I do think knowledge, these two very important knowledge products in our discussion today, which is human development, the human capital indicators or project, as well as the human development index. These are two very important knowledge products that help to open up a dialogue. You may, I don't think we want to come up with prescriptive policy recommendations, because it's a complex subject matter, but it opens up the dialogue, I believe, in many countries. And we have seen that with the Human Capital Project, as well as with the Human Capital Index. So it opens up the discussion for a narrative that can develop for systems change. But I do think much more needs to be done so that we can ensure that politicians who have short time cycles can look at the future, because what we do today has such an impact on the future. And this is going to be a continued struggle, but some of the systems, more integrated work that we are doing at the country level to be able to show how systems change can lead to good development outcomes, including human development. And here is where the Human Capital Index and the Human Capital Project can make a difference by perhaps being the metric that measures the progress on human development with system changes. I think these are going to be hugely important knowledge products that we together as two institutions very much wanting to see people at the center of development we need to work together. So I'm all for a greater partnership, and we are not in competition. We are complementary to each other. And I want to thank Achim. I know you did this. You came to Bali to help launch the first human capital project. I was in Bali, so I knew about this. So I think this is a great sign of partnership. And finally, I'd like to just thank the World Bank teams as well as the UNDP teams. All of you are, working hard during this time of pandemic and home-based work and so on, and still be able to come up with these incredible knowledge products. So, which I'm sure is going to generate a lot of good discussion, we hope, that will lead to good outcomes for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari. This is all the time we have for the first segment. It was really a great conversation, and I would like to thank you, Administrator Achim Steiner and Managing Director Mari Pangestu, for your time and also for sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you both. Now on to our second segment. Thank you both. On to our second segment. Let's get down to nuts and bolts of the report. As we hear from our experts from UNDP and World Bank, so for the attendees and colleagues who are joining us live now, you can share your questions with us through chat box. It's on the right side of your screen. And once we are done with our experts, we'll come to your questions. To start, I would like to invite Pedro Conceição, Director of Human Development Report Office, to walk us through the technical aspect of the report. Pedro, good to see you. Congratulations on the 30th anniversary, and the floor is yours.
Farhad, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to be given this opportunity to discuss the 2020 Human Development Report. It's indeed 30 years since we published the report for the first time, and the thanks are not due to me, but to all the colleagues that over the last 30 years have been consistently producing human development reports and advancing the development discourse with this powerful idea that people should be at the center of development. I do think that the 2020 HDR is an easy read. I don't know if Kathleen and Richard agree. And I think that in my initial comments, I can be rather brief because both Achim and Mari have already covered a lot of the content of the report. So let me just start by reiterating the central idea or premise of the report, which is the following. As we continue to confront the pandemic, but also a range of other challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, development trends going into reverse, as colleagues at the World Bank have documented so clearly. The report really is an invitation to look at all of these challenges less as separate problems and more as reflections of this unprecedented moment in our history and in the history of our planet. A moment that is characterized by the fact that human pressures on the planet are driving a dangerous planetary change. It's not that the planet hasn't changed in the past, it changes all the time. But these changes are now being driven by us, and they are dangerous to ourselves. We heard that many are suggesting that this should even be given a different geological name, a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. And they are dangerous because they are resulting in an unprecedented set of risks. So COVID-19 might be an example, because we know that the virus jumped from animals to humans, and even if we don't understand exactly how that happened in the case of COVID-19, we do know that there's been a frequency, an increase in the frequency of these zoonotic diseases, and also that this increase in the frequency is linked to planetary pressures. So climate change, COVID-19 may be illustrations of the kind of risks that we confront going forward. So this is really the central message of the report. Now, I'll just want to briefly and quickly elaborate on three key points from the report. First, what is the challenge? Secondly, what is the goal as we confront this challenge? And then finally, some thoughts on the way forward. So the challenge is that we are not only facing a new type of risks, as I've indicated, but they are actually superimposed, as we've heard from Achim and Mari, on a world with large and often growing inequalities, and that these inequalities are actually being exacerbated when these risks materialize in shock. So to go back to COVID-19, we do know that economic impact has been worse for women than for men, in part because women are overrepresented in some of the sectors that were hardest hit, but also because some of the social norms related to the expectations on the role of women in homework have reasserted themselves. So women have pulled back from the labor force. We've seen drops of as much as 10 percentage points in the labor force participation of women in many countries. And this actually represents a reversal of progress that had taken a number of decades to achieve. But actually, this pattern holds more broadly. So the numbers that hopefully you'll see on the screen show that countries that face more ecological threats, so things like droughts, floods, storms, are also those where gender inequality is higher. And furthermore, that if we look at inequality in human development more broadly, the story is very much the same. So these inequalities are linked to planetary change, not only in terms of effects, but also given the asymmetries in consumption and in power between those that over-extract and over-pollute and those bearing the consequences. So these numbers show that by the end of this century, the poorest countries in the world, who are actually those that have contributed the least to climate change, could experience up to 100 days more of extreme temperature, while rich countries could actually experience 18 days less. But this is not inevitable because, as the blue lines show, those 100 days could be cut in half by getting closer to meeting the aspirations of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So my second point is that if we frame these choices by bringing our embeddedness in nature forward to the core, the goal of advancing human development, which remains vital and central, needs to be supplemented by being mindful also of these pressures that we're putting on the planet, because otherwise the very notion of human development for many today and perhaps everyone in the future will be foreclosed. So if we compare the Human Development Index and the new index of planetary pressures that we've produced, represented in this graph, the Human Development Index on the horizontal axis, the planetary pressures on the vertical axis, we see, if we plot countries in this chart, the blue dots here, that no country has yet achieved this aspirational destination of high human development and low planetary pressures, the green triangle here in the figure. So some are closer and moving in that direction, but none fast enough. So the second point is about defining the goal. Therefore, the goal is for all countries to move more quickly in advancing human development while easing planetary pressures. Now, advancing human development is not only about people's well-being. So it's very central to this notion of human development is the agency part. Sometimes even Human Development Index and Human Development concept as a whole are associated with notions of well-being. And of course they are important, but for human development as important is this idea that people have agency and can be empowered. It's about giving people conditions to make different choices. And so this brings me to the last point on the way forward. And the report lays out, as Achim has already mentioned, what we call 3 mechanisms of change to enable and encourage people to make different choices. So these mechanisms of change hopefully do speak to policymakers, but they are meant to engage society at all levels, civil society, individual choices, business. So the first has to do with social norms. Achim has already gone over these three mechanisms, so I can be brief, but the fundamental idea is that much like social norms around things like using masks or smoking in shared spaces have changed and can actually change quite quickly, we must now establish norms that give greater weight to easing planetary pressures as we continue the aspiration of expanding human development. There's actually some evidence already that during the pandemic, internet searches on things like recycling and reusing have gone up. Second, and here I can be really brief, prices and regulation, which can be used to shift incentives, economic incentives. And here it's important not only to incorporate damages from planetary pressures in prices, but also phasing out harmful subsidies that encourage that same behavior that we are seeking to change. Fossil fuel subsidies is a good example, well known to all of us, and the current context of low energy and oil prices provide a favorable context to make those changes in subsidies. And then finally, this notion of looking at nature less as a constraint, but actually as an opportunity to both advance human development and restore ecosystems. So an example has to do with this notion of the blue economy, and Mari has already spoken to some of the work that the World Bank is doing in restoring seascapes, for instance, where we do know that in addition to the ecological benefits, there are plenty of economic opportunities and opportunities more broadly to advance human development. So standing in the way of moving in this direction are these imbalances in power and voice. And I'll close with a striking example, in my view, that we highlight in the report that has to do with the fact that, according to our estimates, the contribution of indigenous peoples on a per-person basis to manage forests that, as you know, can work as a carbon sink, is roughly equivalent to the carbon dioxide emissions per person of the top 1% of the global income distribution. So this shows the asymmetries in power, voice, and in contributions to both the planetary pressures and those that are seeking to mitigate those pressures. And in fact, we know that these indigenous peoples are in many cases marginalized and even persecuted around the world. So ultimately, these inequalities are putting people and planet on a collision course. The United Nations Secretary General at the end of last year made a powerful speech in which he said that we are at war with our planet. We are at war with nature. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can make different choices, and our aspiration is that this 2020 Human Development Report will help to put some signposts on how to continue to advance human development while easing planetary pressures, obviously with the aspiration to move us towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. So I look forward to hearing the comments from Kathleen and Richard to the rest of the discussion today, but perhaps more importantly, to continue the dialogue beyond today going forward. Thank you, Farhad.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Before bringing in our World Bank experts, I wanted to call on all the attendees that are watching us live to please share your questions with us through the chat box. Now, I would like to turn to Kathleen Beagle, acting Chief Economist for the World Bank's Human Development Group, to share her reflections with us. Kathleen, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to give a few comments and reflection on this very valuable report. It was a pleasure to read. Don't be fooled. It's not an easy read. It is an extremely dense report, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it because there are so many hidden gems throughout the report and so many big ideas and nuanced ideas. And I think we've heard a lot from the speakers already about many of those important ideas that the report lays forward. So I wanted to use what little time I have here to just reflect on how I think the Human Development Program at the World Bank can can bring these ideas into our own thinking, and how the ideas in the report, I think, are already mirrored in a lot of the work the human development team at the bank is doing. So I just wanted to reflect on two particular areas. Very simply put, the operational agenda in the bank and the knowledge agenda. These are the two pieces of our work that keep us moving forward, and where we invest so much of our effort. So on the operational side, I think there's huge potential for our human development agenda to both support adaptation and invest in mitigation. And we're already seeing a lot of that work through our Human Capital Project program. So just to give some illustration of that, on the health side, in our regional disease surveillance systems project, we're working to strengthen integrated vector management and approaches that align with the timing and location of activities around climate-induced shifts in disease burden. In education, the report talks about education for sustainable development. So how can we grow that idea? We're working towards adaptation measures in school construction, as well as our investments in retrofitting education facilities. But we're also working on introducing climate change content into school curriculum in programs, and that's a space we can also grow. And at the tertiary level, where we're investing in skills programs like the Africa Centers for Excellence, there are tracks of that program that give grants for developing technologies and processes to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And again, I think we can look towards building on what we're learning from that program. And of course, there is our huge safety nets and social protection agenda. And here we've seen in the last few years the growth of adaptive safety nets programs, which will build resilience among the poor, but in a climate smart way, and helping poorest and most vulnerable people living in, for example, the Sahel region, to have the opportunity to respond to shocks, but also invest in mitigation in their income earning opportunities. So I think we, working with the UNDP, can build up this agenda and really grow how we do human development investments in the bank towards a climate smart future, taking into account all the excellent points raised in this report. Of course, we're not only about our operational agenda, we're also about our knowledge work. And, here, as someone who's worked on a lot of regional reports, this report in particular really resonates with me because of the many ideas and data that it puts forward. The bank continues to look at how we can leverage our operational programs to identify what works in these programs, what do we know about the impact of these programs, and how we can improve the design for future projects. We have a robust program of impact evaluation throughout the human development portfolio. And I think it would be great to work with the UNDP to build that up to further feedback knowledge into operational design. The second area on the knowledge agenda I want to highlight, we've talked a lot about measuring performance, the Human Development Index, and our own Human Capital Index. And I want to applaud the UNDP team for thinking about a further adaptation of the Human Development Index. And I think that's very much in the spirit of what the World Bank has done with the Human Capital Index. Our own 2020 index introduced a utilization measure to understand how human capital going from childhood to adulthood is utilized in the labor market. And I think we can explore opportunities to further nuance our own human capital index to accommodate issues around climate smart human capital, adaptation and mitigation intersections with human development. So I look forward to continuing this dialogue and building from this great report. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Now I would like to give the chance for comments to Richard Damania. He's our Chief Economist for the World Bank Sustainable Development, to briefly share his thoughts with us. Richard.
Thank you so very much, Farhad, and thank you, colleagues. These are hard acts to follow, and there's not much to say when people like Achim, Mari, and Kathleen have said it all. It was a wonderful report to read. It was not an easy read. And especially commendable, of course, about the report was the fact that you highlight the interdependence between human health, economic health, and planetary health. And that is one of the major contributions of this report, especially a report on human development, to stretch out and look at natural capital and planetary health and look at the implications of that. And one of the really nice things that this report does is it gives us a dashboard of new metrics, and in particular metrics that would link the Human Development Project, as we saw, with natural capital, and tries to build those interconnections. And I'll come back to that a little bit more. But what I thought was really nice and valuable, and perhaps everyone has said everything else, but what I can point out to one of the points that I thought was really, really nice to read in this report was, what does it take to get change? It tries to address that very difficult issue. And of course, we all know what the standard policies are. We need incentives, we need investment, so on and so forth. The report rehearses that. But then it drives a little bit deeper, and when do you actually get change? And as you dig into the report, about the middle of the report, it emphasizes the importance of values. And of course, values are not exclusively, but are largely driven by ideas, and ideas are driven by knowledge. And indeed, if we go back in time, Keynes recognized the power of ideas, and Keynes told us that ideas are more important than investment. If Keynes recognized ideas, it was in a sense his rival, Milton Friedman, who practiced the power of ideas. And Milton Friedman recognized that it would take a generation to overturn the Keynesian consensus and the ideas and the policies that Keynes gave us. And it took a generation of thinking to cast the government as villain and the private sector as a savior. And that was a threshold moment in terms of values and thinking. If we look at ourselves now, where this Human Development Report comes out, we are at another threshold because of COVID and the Anthropocene. And this is where we're at an inflection point and need a new set of ideas. And the new set of ideas in which this report and other work is driving us down, I think needs to be very, very firmly focused on the idea of decoupling. Decoupling economic growth, economic goods, from environmental bads and inequality. And we need the policies, we need the values, we need the social norms that will drive us to this decoupling. So it is not a matter of either the environment or equity and growth, it is both. We need the environment, we need all. We need greater equality and we need the economic growth. Without the prosperity, of course, we know that we cannot deliver. So given the importance of this topic, given that we are at an inflection point, I would like to urge the UNDP not to regard this as being something experimental, but to really make this something very important where they deepen the important work that you've done. I'm going to end with two small technical points. I think you should deepen your work and begin to incorporate into your index, for example, pollution, which I could not see in there. I looked at this a number of times. We know pollution for human development is very important. We know pollution shortens lives, and we know that it stunts economic growth. Surely there is ample scope to cover some of the material in the survey of actually bringing pollution into your human capital index. Secondly, I think you also need to nuance or expand a little bit more the way you consider some of the problems with climate change. At the moment, you have a human development index, and you reduce that human development index based on the amount of greenhouse gases produced per person in a country, so per capita greenhouse gases. If we look in terms of per capita greenhouse gases, who's polluting the most, just combustion-based greenhouse gases, usually a country like Saudi Arabia will rank very highly. Lots of gasoline production, very few people, very high greenhouse gas per person. But the number two is Kazakhstan. But surely we wouldn't want to put the same policy weight on Kazakhstan as we would on the biggest polluter in the world that produces 30% of emissions. So whilst the per capita indicator is a good one for equity, we need another one as well in terms of where the policy focus should be. So my suggestion is regard this very much as a work in progress, something that you can deepen. It is extraordinarily important because of the links that you actually make. My very last point is your messages resonate very much, as all the other speakers from the World Bank have said, with what we do. So we're working on finance, raising finance for climate, for biodiversity, etc. We're working deeply on the issue of subsidy reform, We know many of the policies right now are not only regressive, but they're bad for the environment. And we're trying to link everything that we do, as our managing director told you, in terms of trying to garner also the climate benefits. And we're trying to develop a framework. And what does it actually mean to build back better? It means, I think, generally we want to build resilience, we want to build inclusion, we want to be sustainable, and we want to be efficient. We look forward very much to continuing this dialogue, whether it's an analytical work or otherwise. We're working together with the team. And so Pedro and the team, genuine congratulations on a very much needed report. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those comments. Colleagues, Pedro and other panelists, if you agree, I would like to extend the duration of this segment for a few more minutes so we can get some questions. I have a number of really great questions that are coming to me. So I would like to take two questions that are, the first is coming from a UNDP colleague. And the question is, what incentives can be given to politicians in order to make them think more long-term about development? And if I may also pose another question, and I think that this goes to you, Pedro. The UNDP report suggests that we should shift from territorial to net emissions by individuals. How would this shift influence accountability and incentives for change? And for colleagues from the World Bank, Richard, there is a question for you, if I may also ask you, and then you can take this question after Pedro is done. The question is, what is the bank doing to help developing countries on adaptation to fight climate change? I know this has been mentioned, but if you can please elaborate a little bit more on this. So Pedro, over to you first.
Okay, Farhad, thank you. I must say I'm a little bit dispirited because both Kathleen and Richard said the report is hard to read, but I don't think so. So colleagues, take a look at it and you'll see that's actually a very easy read. Well, first let me thank you, Kathleen and Richard, for the very thoughtful and important comments. Kathleen, looking forward to working with you, especially if you're thinking about incorporating some of these planetary pressure-related dimensions into the HCI. It would be a pleasure. Richard, I want to pick up particularly on this point that we emphasize of mechanisms for change, the power of ideas, and how they are reflected in values. And this is very central to the concept and approach of human development. And it goes back to the work of Amartya Sen, for instance, on famines. You know, the way societies where there is free flow of information and democratic decisions do not accept a famine is not because people or the majority of the people are going to suffer it on a personal basis, because it's a moral outrage. A society would not accept famine. And so this links a little bit to this point, the question about incentives for policymakers. One of the reasons why the report may be a little bit hard to read at some point is because our premise is that it's important to lay out a lot of the evidence about this notion of the Anthropocene that comes from the natural sciences, but also the reflections that are emerging from historians, from archaeologists. Because with the Anthropocene, this notion of time and the actions that we're doing today that are unprecedented in billions of years in the history of our planet, and the consequences that they are having for people not only in the future, but today, increasing awareness about this, hopefully will be reflected in mechanisms of public reasoning that will encourage also policymakers to make different choices. And I think that is happening already in the case of climate. You know, climate doesn't speak directly to us. It's intermediated by the knowledge that we get from scientists, how it is communicated through media, how it's incorporated in policies. We're seeing movements on climate very clearly. But what the report is trying to, as I said, invite us to see climate as one manifestation of this broader challenge that we are confronting. We are putting excessive pressures on the planet. So climate is one dimension, COVID-19 may be another, biodiversity loss may be another. And that's why our index is focused, Richard, to your point about incorporating pollution. There are many aspects of environmental concerns that are important. But the idea here is to put the focus squarely on this notion of planetary pressures. What is putting more the pressures on the planet that are driving these dangerous process of planetary change? And then quickly, briefly, we are not arguing that we should shift to territorial-based emissions. For the carbon aspect of the planetary pressures index, we use territorial-based, but for the material footprint, we actually use a consumption-based measure. And the reason is to a large extent practical, because there is much better and more data on territorial emissions than we have for consumption-based emissions. But in the dashboards that Richard also alluded to, we include both indicators, territorial and consumption-based. And we include also, to go back also to a comment that Richard made on why do we normalize per person and not use other normalization, for instance, the size of the economy. In the dashboard, we also normalize by the size of the economy, the level of emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Richard, would you like to take the other question?
Sure. So that's a very, very good question, and it would be no exaggeration to say that in many countries that are vulnerable, resilience would be at the heart and soul of what we try to do. Very, very quickly, just three little things. One is we're trying to build a resilience metric. And one, of course, no metric, you can't measure something as complex as resilience perfectly. It's an iterative process, but we're making a start. It's an input-based metric. Secondly, of course, where you have vulnerabilities, think, the Caribbean, places in the Caribbean and elsewhere in Latin America, for example, a lot of emphasis goes on preparedness, trying to have plans that actually build resilience into your buildings. But that is not enough. You also need finance, because there will always be a residual risk. It doesn't matter what you do. There will always be some damage coming onto you. And if there is some damage coming onto you, you need to have the money ready here and now. So there's a variety of financial instruments, think of it broadly like insurance, that are designed to respond here and now, strike straight away, here is the money. And then finally, that again is not enough, because we know that the longer you wait and don't have recovery effort, the longer is the damage, and sometimes it can be permanent. So getting immediate recovery efforts into place straight away. And might I say, that there are big teams, not just in the World Bank, but of course in the UN and elsewhere, for whose entire night and day is spent on this issue. So it's a very, very big issue. It's a very important issue. And it is regrettably a problem that will get worse because of climate change. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Richard. I may take a couple of more questions, and this is for all three of you. The first question is, could you give us an example of promising projects in countries to merge the human development and environmental perspective? And the second question is, how do you see the opportunity of COVID-19 to rebuild better, to incorporate the important concept that the report outlined? So this is for all of you. Kathleen, may I now start with you to give us very briefly your answers? Thank you.
Sure. I would be hard pressed, I think, to point to one particular program. And we have the examples I illustrated in my comments were drawn from specific programs in countries like Tanzania and Bangladesh in the Sahel region, among others. So I'm happy to follow up with anyone bilaterally on very specific project program examples. I do want to reflect on the point about COVID. We've been having a lot of conversation in the bank about COVID as an opportunity to, as people like to say, build back better, but to also reimagine how we deliver services. And in the human development space, we can think about the big push coming from COVID, particularly integrating technology into delivery systems, is an opportunity to both make our programs reach people who are traditionally harder to get to, more vulnerable and remote groups and populations, whether or not it's telemedicine or telelearning systems. But it's also an opportunity to make our delivery more efficient and cost efficient and environmentally friendly in how things reach out to populations. So this is an ongoing discussion, and we're hoping that the legacy of COVID is one that is reimagining delivery in a positive way and not only about the recovery that we will so badly need. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Richard, may I give you the floor now, because I would like to give the last words to Pedro.
Absolutely. Let me be very brief. So COVID is an opportunity for us to focus on the future we wish to have and the legacy that we wish to leave. And it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the simple reason that we are spending on the stimulus volumes of money that we will not see available for generations to come. And those volumes that we spend will have legacy impacts, and they will create a pathway of development that we will often not be able to change. So this is a strikingly important moment. And it's a strikingly important moment not just to look at one aspect of development, but to look at it in its entirety, the interdependence of human health, economic health, and planetary health. If the money, as a lot of the money is doing now, keeps going into coal and dirty forms of energy and dirty forms of infrastructure, we've laid down a pathway that's going to be very difficult to recover from, if ever. So indeed, it is a very, very good opportunity. And one of the things we're working on very hard as we speak is to try to craft a practical framework for countries to follow to build back better in ways that deliver benefits now and put you on a path for a better future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. Pedro, floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I can also be brief because I fully agree with what Kathleen and Richard have said. So it's on the fiscal side, clearly, mobilization of fiscal resources are perhaps unprecedented, and the decisions that we make on how to allocate can set the path for many years to come. So in that sense, it's certainly an opportunity. Although if we look at the reality and we go into this in the report a little bit, we're actually seeing some measures being taken that go in the other direction. For instance, I mentioned in my remarks that context of low energy prices, an opportunity to remove fossil fuel subsidies, but in many cases we're seeing actually countries not doing that, in part because of the social pressures that would imply. So I think there are still difficult political economy aspects that need to be considered, but certainly the opportunity is there. And also in the report, we go even beyond the fiscal side to the monetary side, whether it's not time for monetary authorities to also get into this area. I know it's controversial in the literature, in the policy practice, but for instance, we heard the president of the European Central Bank already advocate that outright monetary transactions should take into consideration climate impacts. So I think that we are seeing a change in direction, both in the case of on the fiscal side as well as on the monetary side. And I do think that this wouldn't have happened hadn't we had the COVID-19 shock. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, Kathleen, and Richard. Unfortunately, time is a luxury that we don't have today. But I hope this session provided us all with some food for thoughts. And we will definitely continue with such conversations in the future. And also, I would like to express our apologies for some of the technical issues that some of the participants faced at the beginning. We will have a recorded version of this report, and we will share it with you all very soon. And also, you heard Kathleen. You can reach out bilaterally for any further question that you may have. Now, I would like to ask Ulrika Mudir, Assistant Secretary General and Director of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP, to wrap up this event with her closing remarks. Thank you so much for your patience, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Farhad, and thank you to all of you who have been accompanying us, of course, to the speakers and the panelists for an interesting discussion that I've enjoyed a lot. Especially, of course, thanks to World Bank colleagues, to Mari, to Sheila, to Kathleen and Richard, who made this event happen. And I really hope that this is only the beginning of the conversation that we need to have, not least also that we can see how we can work together, challenging each other in the thought leadership that needs to take place, and then also take it to the policy advice that we would need to give in a coordinated way at country level to really make change happen. I mean, throughout the discussion and the report itself, of course, tells us that the fate of people and planet are intertwined, and it simply doesn't make sense anymore to believe that we have to choose or even have a choice, because in the long run, we save neither or we save both. And we really need this system change we've been speaking about. We need to transform the way we think about what development means. Because development, as we know, that hurts the planet is not development. And I think that this is, of course, the essence of the report. And I was really intrigued also when Richard said, keep moving, because this is also the discussion that we have internally. I think we need to do that, and we would very much like to do it also in close coordination with you colleagues in the World Bank, and sharing the experiences, as I said, both at policy level, but then also at the more practical level in our exchange and the work that we do on the ground. The challenges are not only preoccupying, but they are increasing and they are growing. And our administrator, Achim Steiner, he mentioned that systems don't change systems, people change systems. And here's where I also think that we need to learn from the way we work on the ground, also with not only systems, but also the broader range of partnerships that we need to bring on board, as we have promised, both with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the Paris Agreement and the agenda on the financing for development. So I'm very much looking forward to the continued discussions, I would like to say, but not least also to the continued coordinated work on the ground. So let's see this as the beginning of an interesting ongoing conversation, but not least action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And to all participants joining us today, thank you for joining us, and see you next time.